Good afternoon, everyone. At the end of this month, this being January 2021, the exit of Britain from the EU is to be concluded, the EU being European Union. What few people realize is that, amazingly, the exit of Britain from the European Union and a far-reaching metamorphosis in the political structure of Europe are both presaged in Bible prophecy. Today I want to review a sermon I gave almost 5 years ago, not long after Great Britain voted in a referendum to leave the European Union, and that was on June 23, 2016, when they voted to leave, and Britain had joined the Union in 1973. It was widely believed before the referendum that it would fail, and yet the vote to leave prevailed 52% to 48%, and cited as reasons for the breakaway were out-of-control immigration, a European economic crisis, increasing terrorism tied to immigration, and European other problems with the European situation as it related to Britain and her national sovereignty. A number of public figures, including George Soros, Donald Trump, and many other politicians in Europe, predicted that the exit of Britain would be the beginning of the disintegration of the European Union. And we haven't seen the Union disintegrating yet, but Britain is just finalizing their exit, and we'll see what happens with regard to that. But we might ask, where are the current events that are rapidly changing the globe, economically, politically, and demographically leading? Politicians, pundits, theologians, academics, and others can only guess, but unless they understand correctly what the prophecies of the Bible reveal, they don't really know the answers. However, Bible prophecy not only foretells earth-shaking events which are now unfolding, but it tells why these changes are occurring, and it tells where they will ultimately lead. In today's sermon, I want to discuss how Bible prophecy presaged the exit of Britain from the European Union and what it portends for the future. Few people in our hedonistic, God-defying world understand the keys to Bible prophecy that show us where the world is headed and why. But we can know, you can know, what is in store for Britain, for the United States, and for other nations in the world in the relatively near future. A vital key to understanding Bible prophecy is the identity of Israel among the nations of today. It's been said that the Bible is about 1/3 prophecy, and many of those prophecies are specifically addressed to or relate to Israel. They are related to many other nations as well, but Israel is a key element in the prophecies of the Bible, and what happens to Israel will affect the entire world. Many prophecies of the Old Testament are dual. A number of them were addressed primarily, if not exclusively, to Israel in the latter days, and some to other nations in latter days, the latter days being our day, approaching the end of this age. The vast majority of the prophecies of the Bible pertain to events that have occurred recently or that are unfolding now or will unfold in the relatively near future at the end of this age and the ushering in of a completely new and different age to come. Now, we don't know the exact time frame of how all of these events that are prophesied will come to pass. We don't know exactly when all of these things will occur, the things that have not yet occurred. But we do know the general arrangement, the progression of how things will work out. Jacob uttered a prophecy to his sons concerning what would become of them in the last days. Jacob, another name for him, is Israel. He is the father of the Israelites. And he told his sons in a prophecy what was to become of them in the last days of this era, this age. We read in Genesis 49 verse 1, Jacob called his sons and said, "Gather together that I may tell you what shall befall you in the last days." Notice these things were to be fulfilled in the last days, the latter part of this age that we are living in now. God warned Israel of disaster that was to befall them in the latter days. In Deuteronomy 4 and verse 30, they were told, when you, that is the people of Israel, are in distress, all these things shall come upon you in the latter days, when you turn to the Lord your God and obey his voice. So there was to be distress, there was to be catastrophes that would occur, and the upshot would be that the people of Israel would finally turn to God and begin to obey. But this would occur in the latter days. Moses uttered a similar warning to Israel near the end of his life, as we read in Deuteronomy 31 and verse 29, Moses told the people of Israel, "I know that after my death you will become utterly corrupt and turn aside from the way which I have commanded you, and evil will befall you in the latter days." Evil will befall you in the latter days, because you will do evil in the sight of the Lord to provoke him to anger through the work of your hands. Daniel wrote of the time of the end of this age in Daniel 12 and verse 1. Daniel 12 and verse 1, he said, "There shall be a time of trouble, such as never was since there was a nation, even to that time." Daniel 12 and verse 1. Going on in verse 8, Daniel said concerning things that God had revealed to him, he said, "I heard, but I did not understand. Then I said, my Lord, what shall be the end of these things?" And he said, "Go your way, Daniel, for the words are closed up and sealed until the time of the end." The prophecies of Daniel, although they covered a very long span of time, actually from the time of Daniel up to the very end of the age, but most of those things he did not understand, especially the prophecies following the time that he was living in. But they were sealed until the end of this age. That is, the understanding, the full understanding was not going to be made known until toward the end of the age. And again, that's our time. And more recent decades or years that these things have been understood. To understand what is happening in the world, especially the precipitous decline in the power and influence of Great Britain and the United States, which is ongoing, We need to look back in history to almost 4,000 years ago. God made a series of promises to Abraham, who was a rare man among men who proved faithful to God in the midst of an evil world. We read in Genesis 12 and verse 1, Genesis 12 and verse 1, the Lord said to Abraham, "Get out of your country, from your family, from your father's house, to a land I will show you. I will make you a great nation. I will bless you and make your name great, and you shall be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse him who curses you. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." So all the earth was to be blessed as a result of certain promises God made to Abraham. And all the earth has been blessed by those promises being fulfilled in this age. And in Genesis 15 and verse 5, it says, "He brought him outside and said, 'Look now toward heaven and count the stars, if you are able to number them.' And he said, 'So shall your descendants be.'" In other words, what he was saying is that his descendants would become so numerous that they would be literally innumerable. No, there would be no way that we human beings could count them. Now, there are many trillions of stars, and I was reading something recently about a skeptic who was talking about all the trillions of stars there are, and his point was that the Bible is false because there are far more stars than there are human beings, which is correct. But the point that God was making is that not that there would be literally the same number of descendants necessarily of Abraham as there are stars, but that there would be so many that they would be innumerable as the stars are. No one has counted, and no one will ever count, no human being, that is, will ever count the number of stars there are, because there's simply too many of them, and besides that, we can't see them all anyway, even with the most powerful telescopes that have been developed. In Genesis 17, verse 1, when Abraham was 99 years old, the Lord appeared to Abram and said to him, "I am Almighty God, walk before me and be blameless, and I will make a covenant between me and you and will multiply you exceedingly." Then Abram fell on his face, and God talked with him, saying, "As for me, behold, my covenant is with you. You shall be a father of many nations. No longer shall your name be called Abram, but your name shall be Abraham, for I have made you a father of many nations. I will make you exceedingly fruitful, and I will make nations of you, and kings shall come from you, and I will establish my covenant between you and your descendants after you and their generations for an everlasting covenant, to be God to you and your descendants after you." So God told Abraham, or Abram, who is what his name was until God changed his name, but he told him that he would be a father of many nations, and also that there would be a covenant that would be made between God and his descendants. A covenant that would make them God's people in a particular way. Now, all people are God's people in the sense that God created them, and God loves all the nations on the earth, but he had a special purpose in mind for certain descendants of Abraham, and they were to fulfill a certain role that God had in mind for them in this particular age. After God had tested Abraham, we read in Genesis 22 and verse 15, Genesis 22 and verse 15, "Then the angel of the Lord called to Abraham a second time out of heaven and said, By myself I have sworn, says the Lord, because you have done this thing and have not withheld your son, your only son. Blessing I will bless you, and multiplying I will multiply your descendants as the stars of heaven and the sand which is on the seashore. Again, this is a reference simply to the number being so great that it would be incalculable. And your descendants shall possess the gate of their enemies. In your seed all the nations of the earth shall be blessed, because you have obeyed my voice. Now, notice that the promise was not only a promise of grace to be extended through the Messiah, Jesus Christ, the singular seed or descendant through whom all nations were to be blessed, as other scriptures point out. But the promise also included physical descendants of Abraham, who would be an innumerable multitude as the sands of the seashore and the stars of heaven, and they were to possess the gates of their enemies. These are physical blessings concerning nations. And the blessing that God had given to Abraham was to be passed down as a birthright to his seed through Isaac, his son. But at the time that the promises were first being made to Abram, there was no son. Abraham and his wife eventually grew into old age. Abraham's wife was barren. And the time came when they were quite elderly that Abraham, at his wife's suggestion, tried to solve the dilemma by producing a son through Hagar, his wife's handmaid, which we read about in Genesis 16. And Ishmael was born through that effort. But it was not God's intention to pass the promises of the covenant down through Ishmael. And so we read in Genesis 17, then God said to Abraham, this is in verse 15, Genesis 17, verse 15, as for Sarai your wife, you shall not call her name Sarai, but Sarah shall be her name. And I will bless her and also give you a son by her, and I will bless her, and she shall be a mother of nations, kings of people shall be from her. Then Abraham fell on his face and laughed and said in his heart, shall a child be born to a man who is 100 years old? And shall Sarah, who is 90 years old, bear a child? Abraham said to God, oh, that Ishmael might live before you. God said, no, Sarah, your wife, shall bear you a son, and you shall call his name Isaac. I will establish my covenant with him for an everlasting covenant, and with his descendants after him. As for Ishmael, I have heard you. Behold, I have blessed him, will make him fruitful, and will multiply him exceedingly. He shall beget 12 princes, and I will make him a great nation. But my covenant I will establish with Isaac, whom Sarah shall bear to you at this set time next year. Now, two clues are given in what God said here to Abraham. First of all, Ishmael's descendants were to become a great nation. But the birthright nations were to be greater, and Ishmael's descendants were to dwell to the east of their brethren, that is, of Isaac's descendants who had the birthright. Now, the descendants of Ishmael are the Arabs. They themselves recognized that they are descendants of Ishmael, and there are 12 nations. There are 12 separate tribal groups among the Arabs, as they recognize. And they have long dwelt to the east of the descendants of Isaac. The birthright was passed down through Isaac to his son Jacob, who was later renamed Israel. Esau had been the firstborn of Isaac's sons, and as the firstborn, the birthright was his, but he despised his birthright and sold it to Jacob for a bowl of stew. By intrigue, Jacob later acquired the blessing of his father, which accompanied the birthright. He disguised himself, impersonating his brother Esau, to obtain the blessing by deceit. Now, it was already concluded that, as far as God was concerned, that Jacob would receive the blessing and the birthright. Jacob took matters into his own hands, however. Either had he not done that, he still would have somehow received the birthright. But this is what he did, which was not necessarily really an honorable thing to do. But in Genesis 27, we read about it, verse 26. Genesis 27, verse 26. His father Isaac said to him, "Come now and kiss me, my son." And he came now and kissed him, and he smelled the smell of his raiment and blessed him and said, "See, the smell of my son is as the smell of a field which the Eternal has blessed. Therefore God give you of the dew of heaven and the fatness of the earth and plenty of corn and wine." "Let people serve you and nations bow down to you. Be Lord over your brethren, and let your mother's sons bow down to you. Cursed be everyone that curses you, and blessed be he that blesses you." So the nations and peoples that would bless the descendants of Jacob would be blessed. Those who chose to be their enemies would not fare so well. So Jacob, or Israel, acquired the birthright and the blessing that accompanied it. The descendants of Jacob also were to be an innumerable multitude, as the sand of the seashore. God said to Jacob, Jacob said to God, rather, in Genesis 32 and verse 12, "For you said, I will surely treat you well and make your descendants as the sand of the sea, which cannot be numbered for multitude." This was a promise God had made to Jacob. Jacob had 12 sons. Reuben was the firstborn, but he forfeited his right to the status of firstborn, as we read in 1 Chronicles chapter 5, beginning with verse 1. "Now the sons of Reuben, the firstborn of Israel, for he was the firstborn, but forasmuch as he defiled his father's bed, his birthright was given to the sons of Joseph, the son of Israel. And the genealogy is not to be reckoned after the birthright, so that he, Reuben, is not enrolled in the genealogy according to the birthright. For Judah prevailed above his brethren, and of him came the chief ruler, but the birthright was Joseph's. So the birthright, the right of the firstborn, which was a double portion among the sons, was transferred from Reuben to Joseph. The children of Joseph, although Judah was to be the chief ruler, or the scepter was to be passed on through him. Now, the vast majority of professing Christians assume that when the Bible refers to Israelites, it is referring to the Jews. And I read in scholarly works, I have read a number of times in works by Bible commentators and other Bible scholars who should know better, and they refer to the Jews, even the people, I should say, they refer to the Israelites. Even going back to the time of Exodus, they call them Jews. They call the Israelites Jews, the whole Israelite peoples. This often occurs in such writings, and the fact is that this is highly misleading. And many people have been misled by theologians and ministers, Bible scholars, into believing the lie that the Israelites, all of them, are Jews. And they have no understanding or knowledge of the prophetic events now unfolding, because they do not understand, for one thing, that there is a difference between Israelites and Jews. All the descendants of Jacob or Israel are Israelites. That is, all the physical descendants are Israelites physically. And all Jews are Israelites, because they are descended from one of the tribes of Israel, Judah, and actually a couple of other tribes were attached to the nation of Judah after it was split off from the other tribes. And so there could be Jews who are Benjamites or Levites and so forth. But all Jews are Israelites. All the people of Judah, that is, who were all the people who lived in Judah, the nation of Judah that we read about in the Bible, all of those people were Israelites. That is, at least if they had indeed descended from Jacob. There were foreigners mixed in among them. But most Israelites are not Jews. And where the Bible refers to Israel in prophecy, it's often referring not to Jews, but to others instead of Jews, or in some cases in addition to the Jews. Now we have a modern nation that has just recently come into existence, made up of Jewish people primarily, and they call themselves Israel, but the tiny nation of Israel is not the Israel that's being prophesied of in the Bible, where we read about the prophecies of Israel for the most part. Now, some of those prophecies do apply to that area, as well as other parts of the world. But most of the prophecies concerning Israel are not specific to the Jewish people. The birthright promises of national power and greatness were not passed down through the Jews. They were passed down, as we read, through the descendants of Joseph. We read in Genesis 49 and verse 10 that the scepter shall not depart from Judah, meaning royal authority, the office of kingship and so forth, shall not depart from Judah. But we read in 1 Chronicles 5 verse 2, the birthright was Joseph's, the birthright promises. And these promises, the promises of the birthright, have not been understood by even most Bible scholars. Few have ever noticed that God made any promises to Abraham other than the scepter, which is a symbol of royalty or kingship, and eventual salvation through Jesus Christ. The birthright passed on to Abraham's heirs through Joseph were physical blessings to be received by the physical descendants of Israel, and especially the descendants of Joseph. Judah was given the portion of the promise relating to rulership to be passed down through the house of David and ultimately the Messiah, Jesus Christ, who is, physically speaking, a descendant of the house of David. But we need to understand that the birthright promise was given to the descendants of Joseph, not the Jews. The promise of Christ and of grace was passed down through the Jews because, as we read in John 4 and verse 22, Jesus said that salvation is of the Jews. And we read in Romans 1 and verse 16, where Paul wrote that the gospel of Christ is the power of God to salvation for everyone who believes, for the Jew first and also for the Greek. The promises of grace and royal authority eventually culminating in the reign of Christ were and are to be fulfilled through Judah, and especially the Jewish descendants of David. But the birthright promises of national greatness and power were to be given to the house of Joseph, and this was to be done primarily in the latter days. Genesis 49 and verse 1. Genesis 49 verse 1, Jacob called unto his sons and said, Gather yourselves together, that I may tell you what shall befall you in the last days of this age. And of Joseph he said, beginning with verse 22, Joseph is a fruitful bough by a well. His branches run over the wall, and this implies a colonizing people. The archers have bitterly grieved him, shot at him, and hated him. But his bow remained in strength, and the arms of his hands were made strong by the hands of the mighty God of Jacob. Telling us that there would be wars to be fought. That the people of Joseph would have enemies who would seek to defeat them and destroy them. So by the hands of the mighty God of Jacob, his arms would be made strong. From there is the shepherd, the stone of Israel. By the God of your father who will help you, and by the Almighty who will bless you with blessings of heaven above, blessings of the deep that lies beneath, blessings of the breasts and the womb, blessings of your father, have excelled the blessings of my ancestors up to the utmost bound of the everlasting hills. They shall be on the head of Joseph and on the crown of the head of him who was separate from his brothers. These promises imply extraordinary material blessings, power, national greatness on a global scale, greater than any other nations would enjoy. God had promised to Jacob in Genesis 28, verse 14. Genesis 28, verse 14, your descendants shall be as the dust of the earth. You shall spread abroad to the west and to the east, to the north and to the south. And in you and in your seed all the families of the earth shall be blessed. So the children of Jacob, and this would include especially the descendants of Joseph from a physical standpoint, were to spread across the globe, around the globe, to the east, west, north, and south. And in Romans 4 and verse 13, it says, for the promise that he would be heir of the world was not given to Abraham or to his seed through the law, but through the righteousness of faith. They were to be heirs of the world, implying a worldwide empire, so to speak. Now, near the end of his life, Jacob passed on the birthright blessings to the sons of Joseph. As we read, Joseph was considered the firstborn in terms of the birthright blessings after Reuben's transgression. And so we read in Genesis 48 and verse 5, now your two sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, who were born to you in the land of Egypt before I came to you in Egypt, are mine, as Reuben and Simeon. Notice he says in terms of the birthright, Reuben and Simeon, heretofore the firstborn, were being replaced by Ephraim and Manasseh. They shall be mine. Your offspring whom you beget after them shall be yours, and they will be called by the name of their brothers in their inheritance. In other words, they would be regarded as the first and the second in line, sharing together the birthright inheritance that went to Joseph. God also inspired Jacob in bestowing this momentous birthright to give a greater part of the blessing to the younger of the two, who was Ephraim. Now Jacob was blind so that he could not see the lads before him. We read in Genesis 48 that Israel stretched out his hand and laid it upon Ephraim's head, who was the younger, and his left hand upon Manasseh's head, guiding his hands wittingly. So the right hand, which would be the preferred hand, so to speak, went onto the head of Ephraim, the left to Manasseh, implying that Ephraim was to be preferred above Manasseh in this blessing. And but he guided his hands wittingly, says he knew what he was doing. For Manasseh was the firstborn. In other words, Joseph expected that his right hand would be on Manasseh's head, who was the firstborn. And goes on to say, he blessed Joseph and said, God, before whom my fathers Abraham and Isaac did walk, the God which fed me all my life long, unto this day the angel which redeemed me from all evil, bless the lads and let my name be named upon them. Notice that his name specifically, the name of Israel, was to be named on them. They would be known as Israel. Now the other tribes were Israel too, but this name would be especially applicable to them in a special way as leading tribes of Israel. And the name of my fathers, Abraham and Isaac, and let them grow into a multitude in the midst of the earth. So they would be named after Israel and also Isaac and Abraham. Now again, this name Israel was applicable to all the tribes of Israel, but was conferred with special emphasis on the sons of Joseph, Ephraim and Manasseh. And when Israel became divided into two separate kingdoms after the reign of Solomon, the northern 10 tribes retained the name Israel, not the southern part of the country, which was Judah, but the northern tribes, where Ephraim and Manasseh were the leading tribes, retained the name Israel. And they, not the Jews, have continued down through history to be the leading tribes of Israel in terms of power, influence, and numbers, as they were even while the 12 tribes dwelt in the land of Canaan. Joseph objected, and he said, not so, my father, for this is the firstborn. Put your right hand on his head. And his father refused and said, I know it, my son. I know it. He, Manasseh, also shall become a people. He also shall be great, but truly his younger brother shall be greater than he, and his seed shall become a multitude or company of nations. And he blessed them that day, saying, in you shall Israel bless, saying, God, make you as Ephraim and as Manasseh. And he set Ephraim before Manasseh. So here Jacob prophesied of the blessings of Ephraim and Manasseh, both as they were to be blessed collectively, but also individually and distinctly, and how the blessing and birthright promises would be fulfilled. Ephraim was to be greater, and he would be greater first. And they were to be a company of nations. But Manasseh would also become a great nation in its own right. Now, in dividing the promises, the prophetic blessing implied that the descendants of Ephraim and Manasseh would remain together, and they would grow into a great multitude, and then they would become separated. Manasseh becoming a great nation, and Ephraim an even greater company of nations. But neither of these prophecies were fulfilled in ancient times, at least not fully. Ephraim and Manasseh were the leading tribes of the northern kingdom of Israel. After God led the tribes of Israel out of Egypt, having grown into a population of perhaps 2 or 3 million, he placed them in the land of Canaan. But even as they were not particularly responsive to God's commands while they were in the wilderness after being brought out of Egypt, they were not any more responsive after they entered the land of Canaan most of the time. They were persistently unfaithful to God. And after the time of Solomon, the nation of Israel, which consisted of 13 tribes, was divided into two nations: Israel, the northern kingdom, consisting of 10 tribes led by the tribes of Ephraim and Manasseh, and the southern kingdom of Judah with the tribes of Judah, Benjamin, and Levi. And actually, even during the time of the United Kingdom, as you read in the Bible, often the United Kingdom was referred to as Israel and Judah. That was before they were split into two separate kingdoms after the time of Solomon. They historically, all during their time of existence as 13 tribes in the land of Canaan, they had always sort of been divided into those two entities, Israel and Judah. Judah being the leading tribe among the southern tribes, and Ephraim and Manasseh, especially Ephraim, being the leaders in the north. Persistent rebellion against God led to punishment and a series of invasions from about 740 to 720 BC. The house of Israel was overrun by the Assyrians, and the people of Israel, many of them were killed, but others who were not killed or who did not somehow escape were driven out of their own land, out of their homes and cities, and taken as captives to Assyria or to the area around the southern shores of the Caspian Sea, where the Medes and others lived near in an area where Syria was dominant. And after that, as far as most of the world is concerned, they were lost from view. Most people, including most Bible scholars today, have no idea what happened to the Israelites, who were the 10 tribes who were carried into captivity by the Assyrians. Not that they couldn't know, but they don't know, partly because they simply don't want to know. And so we read in 2 Kings 17, verse 18, "Therefore the Eternal is very angry with Israel and removed them out of his sight, and there was none left but the tribe of Judah only." So notice who was removed. It was Israel. They were removed and driven from sight until they came lost from view. Actually, some of the Jews were also taken captive by the Assyrians and moved to the same area. So there were a few Jews, relatively few Jews, mixed in with the captives at that time that Israel was carried into captivity, that same general time. And they became blended in with the Israelites who had been carried captive by the Assyrians, but it was primarily the 10 tribes. What remained was the kingdom of Judah, which are often called Jews. Israel became known in what is called in history the lost 10 tribes of Israel, although they were never totally lost, but as far as most of the world is concerned, they are lost. And these 10 tribes of Israel included the tribes of Ephraim and Manasseh. Israel had abandoned God to worship idols. They had rejected his Sabbaths. They had forgotten who God was. And most of them forgot who they were. Even many of them, forgot that they were Israelites. Again, not entirely, but to a large extent. We read in Ezekiel 20. Ezekiel 20 and verse 11, I gave them my statutes and showed them my judgments, which if a man does, he shall live by them. Moreover, I gave them my Sabbaths to be a sign between them and me, that they might know that I am the Lord who sanctifies them. Yet the house of Israel rebelled against me in the wilderness. They did not walk in my statutes. They despised my judgments, which if a man does, he shall live by them. And they greatly defiled my Sabbaths. Going on in verse 23 of Ezekiel 20, God said, I raised my hand in an oath to those in the wilderness, that I would scatter them among the Gentiles and disperse them throughout the countries, because they had not executed my judgments, but had despised my statutes. Notice what they were doing. They were despising his statutes. They profaned my Sabbaths, and their eyes were fixed on their father's idols. Now, many people recognize that murder is a sin and it's wrong, and lying and stealing and so forth are things that ought not to be done. But Sabbath breaking to a lot of people isn't considered a big deal. It's not particularly, many people would not even consider that a real sin. Or idolatry. Many people see really nothing wrong with worshiping multiple gods. That's how Israel approached it, how they still approach it today to a large extent. But that's exactly why they were sent into captivity. These were serious, very offensive sins to God. Among the greatest of sins, the greatest offenses were Sabbath breaking and idolatry, because those things are keys to keeping the rest of the commandments faithfully. Keys to keeping your eyes on who is the real God, knowing who the real God is. If you don't keep the Sabbaths and you're worshiping idols, you don't know who is the real God. And that will lead to other sins, and it has and does. A little over a century later, the Assyrian Empire collapsed, and the peoples in the area up around the Caspian Sea, northern Mesopotamia, and so forth, they began to migrate. Actually, some of them had already migrated, but vast movements of peoples occurred at that time. The Assyrians and many of the Israelites among them began moving west for the most part. Actually, they spread abroad in every direction at first, including east and south and north, but the general direction was west and northwest. And eventually most of the Israelite tribes migrated into western and northwestern Europe and the British Isles. Now, during these centuries, the Israelites were not usually called Israelites. They were called by other names. Among the names that they were called were Cimbri, Cimmerians, Celts, Gauls, Angles, Saxons, and so forth. And the movements of these people, as well as other peoples westward over the centuries, is not well advertised, but it is fairly well documented historically if one is willing to search out the information about these migrations. Some of the indications of the Israelitish history of the people living in the British Isles is preserved in their languages and some in their traditions. A number of scholars have written about the similarity between Hebrew and the Celtic languages of the British Isles. For example, in an article, Is the Welsh Language Akin to Hebrew?, we read the following: is the Welsh language akin to Hebrew? It states, there are many indicators that demonstrate our Hebrew origins. This was written in Britain, and the Welsh are among the groups that live in the British Isles as a part of the British people. And so the question is the Welsh language akin to Hebrew? And it says, quote, there are many indicators that demonstrate our Hebrew origins, almost too many to mention. One of these is the language of the Welsh in particular, as a number of linguistic scientists have discovered a remarkable link between Welsh and Hebrew. A scientist by the name of Glass published an article entitled Welsh Hebraisms in the Cambrian Quarterly Magazine and Celtic Repertoire, dated July 1832. In his article, Mr. Glass remarked upon the close resemblance and connection between the Welsh and the Hebrew languages and said that this was the best proof of the Eastern descent of the ancient British. The article went on to provide clear proof by supplying a vocabulary of words in both tongues so closely resembling each other in sound and meaning as to put the question beyond all doubt. It goes on to say previously in 1675, Charles Edwards published a number of Welsh Cambro-Britannic Hebraisms in which he clearly demonstrated that whole phrases in Welsh could be closely paralleled by whole phrases in Hebrew. Mr. L.G.A. Roberts, in his British History Traced from Egypt and Palestine, published in 1919, quotes a certain Eleazar Williams, who wrote several works on the Celts as follows, quote, in the Hebrew, which the ancient British language greatly resembles, the roots of most of the ancient British or real Welsh words may be regularly traced in the Hebrew. Scarcely a Hebrew root can be discovered that has not its corresponding derivative in the ancient British language, but not only the words, their variations and inflections afford a much stronger proof of affinity. And this is from an article on a website called ephraimswatchman.org. There are many words, English words that show a Hebrew origin. For example, the Hebrew word borrow, B-A-R-O, means region or country. The English word borough means a district or a territorial division. The Hebrew word pina means a high and steep hill. The English word pinnacle, the same word with the C-L-E added if you spell it in English letters. The English word pinnacle means a lofty peak or a pointed summit. The Hebrew word ayin means eye. The English word eye means eye. And there are many more. Students of the subject have identified more than 20,000, well over 20,000 English words that they believe are rooted in Hebrew. There's a comedic play written by a Roman, Titus Macius Plautus, believed to have been written sometime between 195 and 189 BC, before Christ, about 2 centuries before Christ. This play is called Ponolus, or it's also called the Little Carthaginian or the Little Punic. Now, of course, being written by a Roman, it's mostly in Latin, but the play contains some text written in Carthaginian Punic in its 5th act. Now, Punic is another name for Phoenician, which in terms of language is virtually the same as Hebrew. Phoenician and Hebrew are the same language. with only slight differences in dialect. Carthage was a city and capital of an empire in North Africa. During the latter part of the first millennium before Christ. And it is identified with the Phoenicians. It was a Phoenician city and empire. The question is, who were the Phoenicians? Now, in modern parlance, the Phoenicians are identified primarily with city-states along the eastern shore of the Mediterranean Sea, primarily Tyre and Sidon, which lay just to the north of Israel. But the term Phoenician is not a name that was used by those peoples of themselves. It is a Greek term that was used later by the Greeks to designate an area that was applied to the eastern shore of the Mediterranean. And the area included not just the area where Tyre and Sidon were north of Israel, but included Israel also. Pretty much the entire length of the eastern shore of the Mediterranean was designated as Phoenicia originally. Moreover, during the era of David and Solomon, the Phoenician city-states became closely affiliated with Israel. And Israel and these Phoenician city-states commingled with one another. In fact, some of the leading king in that area gave some of his area to Israel, and Israelites moved up into that area and settled there. Same with Solomon gave some cities to Hiram, the king of the Phoenician city, the leading king among the Phoenicians, as they will call them to distinguish them temporarily at least from the Israelites. And some of them came down to live in those cities. So they were commingled with each other, and they sailed together in a common fleet of ships to far-flung areas of the world. And in doing so, established colonies along the Mediterranean in areas as far-flung as what we now know as North America. We read in 1 Kings chapter 9, verse 26, beginning with verse 26, King Solomon also built a fleet of ships at Ezion-Geber, which is near Elat on the shore of the Red Sea. Now, it's believed by some, and it's very, very likely, that Ezion-Geber refers to an island just off the coast adjacent to Elat, Elath, or Elat, on the shore of the Red Sea in the land of Edom. Then Hiram sent his servants. It's called the land of Edom. It's actually ruled by Israel, but it was near where the Edomites lived. And Hiram sent his servants with the fleet, seamen who knew the sea, to work with the servants of Solomon. Notice, so we have the so-called Phoenicians and the Israelites blended together in these seagoing voyages, and seagoing vessels that were making trips to far-flung places. And it says they went to Ophir, and there's controversy about exactly where that is, but it's either in somewhere in Africa or southern Asia, Southwest Asia. And they acquired 420 talents of gold from there and brought it to King Solomon. We also read in 1 Kings chapter 10, beginning with verse 21, 1 Kings 10 and verse 21, all King Solomon's drinking vessels were gold, and all the vessels of the house of the forest of Lebanon were pure gold. Not one was silver, for this was accounted as nothing in the days of Solomon. For the king had merchant ships at sea with the fleet of Hiram. Now Hiram was as I said, the ruling monarch, more or less, of the Phoenician city-states. And Solomon had merchant ships at sea with Hiram's fleet. Once every 3 years, the merchant ships, it goes on to say, came bringing gold, silver, ivory, apes, and monkeys. And it brought a lot of other things as well. Some of them are named in some of the other scriptures which refer to this. The city-states we're speaking of and Israel shared a common language. The Phoenician, as I said, the so-called Phoenician language and Hebrew are virtually the same language. Moreover, they not only commingled in terms of business and seagoing affairs. Actually, the Phoenicians were instrumental in helping to build the temple in Jerusalem. And unfortunately, they also commingled culturally in a negative way, because the Israelites eventually adopted the Baal worship of the Canaanite peoples of Tyre and Sidon. In fact, Ahab, one of the kings of Israel, married Jezebel, who was a Sidonian princess, who actively promoted Baal worship in Israel. And she sought to kill, during the reign of Ahab, anyone in Israel who was faithful to the true God, to the eternal Yahweh. And she did kill many of them. So, who are the Phoenicians? The Phoenicians that you read of in history books were really mostly Israelites, because the Israelites who sailed with and colonized with the Tyrians and Sidonians were far more numerous than the people who populated those cities along the coast. Far more numerous. Solomon was the senior partner in this partnership between Hiram and Solomon. And to the Greeks, they would not have been able to distinguish in the era of the Israelite kings between the so-called Phoenicians and the Israelites, or the people of Tyre and Sidon and the Israelites. As far as the Greeks would have been concerned, they would have been the same people, speaking the same language, sailing in the same ships, and so forth. So the point here is that Carthage was actually a mostly Israelite country. And the language could as easily be called Hebrew as Phoenician or Punic. Punic is simply another name for Phoenician or Hebrew. Now, we get back to the play written by Plautus. And a comparison has been made with the early Irish Celtic language used in Britain and the Punic lines in this play, which were written approximately 200 years before Christ. And if you compare it, they're virtually the same. The words are spelled slightly differently, but the words are if you just pronounced the words and read it out, it would sound virtually the same. And this is from an article, The Hebrew Celtic Connection, at the website Israelite.info. Now, another statement from this article is the Welsh language akin to Hebrew states as follows, quote, James Cowles Pritchard was considered to be the most famous language expert of the 19th century. In fact, today he is considered the founder of modern anthropology. This same Pritchard said, quoting Pritchard, says a common language is one of those signs of community of origin which is slow to be abolished, slower than most others. In other words, a common language tends to imply common origin. Now, it might not always do that because, for example, many nations have adopted English, at least as a second language, and they're not necessarily related by descent, or close. I mean, we're all related by descent in terms we're all human beings and children of Adam, but they're not related in terms of their more immediate descent necessarily because they speak the language, the same language, but this is one of many indications that the people of Britain are in fact Israelites. But it's a very strong evidence because this goes back a long ways into history. The Hebrew word for covenant is berith, or it could be pronounced berit. In Hebrew, only the consonants were written and vowel sounds tended to vary. So a Hebrew person might well have pronounced the word for covenant berit or brit. A Hebrew word for man is ish. Thus, the word Brit-ish is derived from Hebrew and would mean in Hebrew covenant man or covenant people. So, is it mere coincidence that the covenant people prophesied to inherit the covenant promises discussed earlier call themselves Brit-ish, meaning covenant man or covenant people, and they reside in the British Isles? In his prophecy for the latter days, Jacob said, quote, Genesis 49, verse 22, Joseph is a fruitful bough, even a fruitful bough by a well whose branches run over the wall. In other words, Joseph, Ephraim, and Manasseh jointly and together was to be a colonizing people in the latter days. Their colonies branching out from the British Isles around the earth. Actually, they were a colonizing people even during the first millennium BC, and we'll be covering that in a future sermon, how they colonized in those days. And we just read evidence a moment ago that they were colonizing in North Africa in the first millennium BC. But they've always been a colonizing people. In fact, the name Hebrew means wanderer. And they've always tended to wander and move various places, going back to ancient times. But together, Ephraim and Manasseh grew into a multitude and then separated according to Jacob's prophetic utterances. The idea that the people of Britain migrated there after having left Palestine or ancient Israel has been labeled unscientific by some scoffers, citing supposed DNA evidence to the contrary. Now, the idea that looking at someone's DNA and being able to accurately determine from where their ancestors may or may not have been centuries ago seems preposterous on its face, especially considering that the Israelite peoples have wandered over much of the globe over the centuries, and other nations have migrated as well over the centuries. across wide expanses of territory. And so actually historical and other evidence is likely to be more reliable and more valuable than any DNA evidence. Nevertheless, is the claim true that DNA evidence indicates that the people of the British Isles did not migrate there from the Middle East, as is sometimes alleged? Is that true? I'm going to quote from an article titled Genetic History of the British Isles from wikipedia.org, Genetic History of the British Isles. This article states that polymorphisms from human blood indicates, quote, the majority of genetic diversity may best be explained by immigration coming from the southeast towards the northwest, or in other words, from the Middle East towards Britain and Ireland, end quote. The same article goes on to say that research indicates that some of the migration was from the Iberian Peninsula, which it was, as we know from history. In fact, Iberian, the word Iberian comes from the same root as Hebrew. You may as well call it the Hebrew Peninsula, Spain and Portugal. Other research from the same article indicates, quote, the oldest surviving male lineages had mostly migrated to Britain from the Balkans. Now, the Balkans are around the Caspian and Black Seas and so forth, where we know the Israelites were located by the Assyrians. And it says, goes on to say, the oldest surviving male lineages had mostly migrated to Britain from the Balkans and ultimately from the Middle East. End quote. So this DNA evidence, as far as it goes and as far as it's given any credence, is generally in agreement with the historical and linguistic research as well as the biblical evidence. The evidence actually indicates that migrations occurred at different times by different routes over many hundreds of years across North Africa and through the Iberian Peninsula into the Balkans and across Europe and by sea. In other words, there are multiple routes of migration for how people from the Israelite tribes reached Britain and the British Isles and parts of Western Europe. Now, I might mention, too, that among scholars, there's a great deal of debate concerning the relevance of DNA markers. And so anyone asserting that the, quote, scientific evidence, as some have, proves that the British peoples are not descended from the Israelites is really arguing from ignorance, not from factual knowledge. Having migrated into the British Isles and other places, the Manassites began moving further west into what later became the United States in the 17th century. But it might be asked, how could the United States be descended from the tribe of Manasseh to a large extent when a large part of our people have come from many nations besides England? And the answer is this: a large part of Manasseh remained with Ephraim until the separation, when they moved across the Atlantic to New England and other areas associated with the colonies in New England. But our forefathers, we are told, were to be sifted through many nations as corn through a sieve, and yet not a grain was to fall to the earth or to be lost. As we read in Amos 9 and verse 9, I will command and will sift the house of Israel among the nations, as grain is sifted in a sieve. Yet not the smallest grain shall fall to the ground. In other words, God kept track of his people, even as they were being scattered across the world, especially in Europe and Africa, through many nations, and Asia as well, for that matter. The remnant of the Israelites did filter through many nations. Ephraim and much of Manasseh finally immigrated to England together, but many others of Manasseh have filtered into and through other nations and did not leave them until they came as immigrants to the United States. Most of them after the North American colonies had become a separate nation. Now, that does not mean that every foreigner who immigrated to the United States is of the stock of Manasseh, which is manifestly not true. There have been people from places all over the world and all ethnic groups just about you can imagine, but who have migrated to the United States or immigrated. But undoubtedly the bulk of the people, especially until recently, were Manassites originally. And it should also be observed that the people of Israel always absorbed Gentile groups, and the Gentiles that lived among them eventually became integrated into the Israelite peoples through intermarriage and were counted as Israelites. As today, anybody that has moved to America, at least legally immigrated to America, is considered an American, and we're, in a sense, all one people, even though we've come from various locations and ethnicities and so forth. We share a lot in common as Americans, and the people that were associated with Israel were considered the same people as the eventually many of the Israelites, as I mentioned earlier, commingled with the people along the coast and the Canaanite cities there, and they became, in effect, the same people. At least many of them did. In 1800 A.D., the United Kingdom and the United States were small and relatively insignificant among the Earth's nations. The United Kingdom consisted of the British Isles, a small part of India, Canada, and a few little islands. Their biggest and most important colonial possession had in fact been the 13 colonies that became the United States as they broke off from Britain. And the United States consisted of those 13 original colonies and 3 added states by 1800. Neither of these countries possessed any great wealth or power at that time. But beginning in 1800, these two little nations began to sprout and grow into vast national riches and power such as no other people had ever possessed. Soon Britain's empire, which is still the greatest empire that's ever existed in history, spread around the world till Great Britain possessed 1/4 of the Earth's land mass, and much of the population of the world was under the rule of the British throne. The sun never set on her possessions. It was a worldwide empire. Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa, and other areas that were part of the British Empire were given dominion status in the 19th century and eventually became nations ruling themselves independently of England. And so they became a company or a commonwealth of nations joined together not by a legal government, but by their common heritage and by the throne of David. We'll be discussing that in more detail in future sermons as well. From the time of their captivity in circa 720 BC, the peoples of Israel were relatively without influence, and great Gentile nations and empires dominated the world scene, including Egypt, Assyria, the New Chaldean or Babylonian Empire, the Persian Empire, the Greco-Macedonian Empire of Alexander the Great, the Roman Empire, and its various resurrections. And so, from the time of Israel's captivity in the 8th century BC until recent times, these Gentile empires have dominated the earth. God's promises seem to be in abeyance, as indeed they were. Now remember that Jacob had foretold what was to become of Israel in the latter days. The promises of national dominance would have to wait, for the most part, for the latter days, except for a brief period of exceptional power and dominance during the days of David and Solomon. And we'll be discussing more about that too in the future, God willing. Now, God had warned the people of Israel in Leviticus 26, verse 18. He said, if you will not yet for all this hearken to me, then I will punish you 7 times more for your sins. Now, the 7 times or 7 prophetic times in this prophecy relates to a period of punishment or withholding of promises. And a time is a prophetic year of 360 days. 7 times would be 7 times 360, or 2,520. During Israel's punishment, having been sent into captivity, deprived of the dominance promised under the birthright, each day represented a year, that is a solar year, being fulfilled. And we see the same principle in the rebellion of Israel in the wilderness, where God punished them a day for a year, 40 days during which they spied out the land, and they were punished for 40 years for their rebellion, a day for a year. And there are other examples of that in Scripture. A prophetic year, as I said, is 360 days. Evidence indicates that prior to the flood, and perhaps even for a short time after the flood, years actually were 360 days. Now they're about 365 and a quarter days. A solar year is. But 360 times 7 is 2,520. And from the year 721, the time of the final destruction of the Israelite nation by the Assyrians, and there are different opinions about the exact year, but it's around very close to 721, if not 721. But from 721 to 1800 is 2,520 years. When this 2,520 year withholding of the birthright expired, God began to fulfill the covenant promise to Abraham concerning his descendants, and particularly concerning Ephraim and Manasseh. And it was not because of any British or American goodness, superiority, or worthiness, but because God was faithful to his promise. And these things were to be done in the latter days. And beginning in 1800, these two birthright peoples, brother nations, so to speak, suddenly burst forth and quickly grew into the greatest world powers in all of history. Nothing like this has happened in all of history. Beginning around 1800, God caused the birthright nations to begin to acquire wealth and power and greatness such as no empire had ever before acquired in the same quantities. Together, the British and Americans descended from the tribe of Joseph, as we believe, came into possession of more than 2/3, almost 3/4, at their peak of the cultivated resources and wealth of the whole world. For a period of 200 years, Great Britain and the United States were the dominant powers of the world and possessed the greatest part of its wealth and productive capacity. An amazing fact of history is this sudden propulsion from virtual obscurity of two nations, two brother nations, to the most fabulous wealth and power ever possessed by any people. Britain became Great Britain, a gigantic, stupendously wealthy commonwealth of nations, and the United States emerged as the single greatest nation in history in terms of wealth and power. And thus have been fulfilled the birthright promise to Jacob's descendants. No other nations are reasonable candidates for having fulfilled in them these covenant promises. If these promises have been fulfilled in other nations, let's see who they are. And if they've not been fulfilled, then God has not been faithful to his word. Despite the blessings that we two peoples have enjoyed, the wealth and power of these nations is fast slipping away. And we might ask why. God not only promised blessings for the latter days, he also promised something else. Moses prophesied that the people of Israel would forsake God and break his covenant. Has our nation forsaken God? Is Britain and America forsaking God? Even to the relatively limited extent that they have even known the true God? I'll let you think about that for a while. But here's what Moses said to the Israelites in Deuteronomy 32 and verse 8. He said, when the Most High divided their inheritance to the nations, when he separated the sons of Adam, he set their boundaries of the people according to the numbers of the children of Israel. For the Lord's portion is his people, Jacob is the place of his inheritance. But he goes on to say, verse 15, but Jeshurun, which is a symbolic name for Israel, Jeshurun grew fat. It's in the past tense, but this is a prophecy for the future. Jeshurun grew fat and kicked. You grew fat, you grew thick, you are obese. Then he forsook God who made him and scornfully esteemed the rock of his salvation. They provoked him to jealousy with foreign gods, with abominations. They provoked him to anger. They sacrificed to demons and not to God, to gods they did not know, to new gods, new arrivals that your fathers did not fear. Of the rock who begot you, you are unmindful and have forgotten the God who fathered you. And when the Lord saw it, he spurned them because of the provocation of his sons and his daughters. And he said, I will hide my face from them. I will see what their end will be. For they are a perverse generation, children in whom there is no faith. The Bible prophesies that the nations of Israel, including especially the descendants of Ephraim and Manasseh, will be punished at the end of this age, in part by being conquered by a short-lived union of European states or nations. There are many prophecies in the Bible about this captivity, and other prophecies, a number of them, about their return from captivity after Christ returns. So the exit of Great Britain from the European Union is a necessary step in setting the stage for coming events that will culminate in the greatest series of catastrophes to befall any people, and those catastrophes will affect not only them but the world. Catastrophes greater than any the world has ever seen or could imagine. And finally, it will set the stage for the return of Jesus Christ to the earth to save mankind from utter destruction, as we're told in Matthew chapter 24, after which he will establish his world-ruling kingdom of peace on the earth.